You're standing in a narrow carriage house on Arch Street in Philadelphia, 1897. Before you sits a boxy electric vehicle called the Electrobat, and its two inventors, Jeantaud and Pedro Salom, are about to sell you a vision so far ahead of its time that the entire city will abandon it within 3 years. I'm Jacob, and what you're about to hear is a story about infrastructure failure that cost us a century. The Electrobat was not some fever dream or patent office abstraction. It was real hardware, manufactured and assembled, with Salom and Jeantaud building them in a converted stable at 1315 Arch Street. The first models rolled onto Philadelphia streets in the spring of 1897, and they looked nothing like the carriages that dominated the roads. The body was low and boxy, painted in a cream or maroon color depending on the owner's taste. Beneath was a frame of wood and steel, and the real innovation sat underneath. 60 cells of lead-acid batteries weighing around 800 pounds, coupled to an electric motor that produced between 1 and 1.5 horsepower. 1.5 horsepower doesn't sound like much in the year 2024, but in 1897, this was not a parlor trick. This was transportation. The Electrobat could reach speeds of 20 miles per hour. More importantly, it could travel about 40 miles on a single charge, and in a city where most daily commutes didn't exceed 10 miles. This was practically infinite range. The Electrobat didn't require hand cranking. It didn't belch smoke. It didn't demand the kind of mechanical sympathy that gasoline vehicles required. You simply climbed in, adjusted your levers, and drove. For wealthy Philadelphia residents accustomed to hiring drivers for horse-drawn carriages, the Electrobat represented liberation. Salom and Jeantaud understood this completely. They didn't just sell vehicles. They sold an idea that Philadelphia could pioneer a new kind of urban transportation system, one entirely removed from the horse economy that had dominated cities for thousands of years. By 1898, roughly 200 Electrobats were on Philadelphia streets. 200 might sound small until you understand what Salom and Jeantaud had done with their capital and reputation. They didn't just manufacture cars. They began building charging stations. This is the moment where the story transforms from a simple invention narrative into something far more ambitious and far more fragile. Salom and Jeantaud recognize that a vehicle is worthless without infrastructure. You cannot buy a car that travels 40 miles if there's nowhere to charge it beyond your personal garage. So they did something almost nobody does in the automotive industry even today. They invested in the ecosystem before the ecosystem existed. They established charging depots throughout Philadelphia, particularly in central business districts and residential neighborhoods on the main line where wealthy clients lived. The charging process itself was slow by modern standards. A full charge required between 6 and 8 hours of continuous connection to a charging station powered by the city's growing electrical grid. But here's the crucial detail. Most Electrobat owners didn't drive their vehicles continuously throughout the day. A Philadelphia businessman might drive to his office in the morning, park the vehicle for 6 hours while conducting business, and charge it during those idle hours. He would drive home in the evening, park it in his carriage house, and charge overnight. The charging network made this lifestyle possible. By 1899, Salom and Jeantaud had established enough charging infrastructure throughout Philadelphia that owning an Electrobat was genuinely practical. They had solved the problem. They had created a closed-loop system, manufactured vehicles, distributed them through sales, and built the necessary charging stations to keep those vehicles operational. On paper, this should have worked. In reality, it worked. For exactly 3 years, it worked. The decline of the Electrobat in Philadelphia began not with a technological failure, but with a shift in what people wanted from vehicles. Gasoline automobiles, which had existed in various forms since the 1880s, began improving dramatically in the late 1890s. More importantly, they improved in the direction that mattered to American consumers: range and speed. The Duryea brothers had been developing gasoline vehicles in Massachusetts. Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler had been refining the gasoline engine in Germany. By the year 1900, Ransom Olds in Detroit had begun manufacturing gasoline vehicles in genuine volume using assembly line principles. The Oldsmobile could travel 100 miles on a tank of gasoline. It could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour. Perhaps most importantly, it could travel those 100 miles without requiring access to a specialized charging network. Gasoline was beginning to appear at general-purpose fuel stations. Unlike Electrobat owners, Oldsmobile owners didn't need to plan their journeys around charging station locations. But this technological competition was only half the story. The second half was structural and involves a person whose name has largely vanished from history. Colonel Henry Clay Dudley was a wealthy Philadelphia investor who had initially backed Salom and Jeantaud. He believed in the Electrobat. He believed in the charging network. But as gasoline vehicles began selling in larger numbers and as the capital requirements to maintain and expand the charging infrastructure became increasingly clear, Dudley's confidence began to waver. Maintaining charging stations required consistent electrical supply, which required investment. Expanding the network required capital that could only be justified if the number of Electrobat vehicles continued to grow. But vehicle sales began declining in 1899 and accelerated downward through 1900. Fewer cars meant fewer charging station visits, which meant lower revenue. Lower revenue meant less capital for maintenance and expansion. And so the system that had been so elegant, so complete, began to unravel not because of technological failure, but because of a loss of faith among the people with capital to sustain it. By the summer of 1900, the charging network was shrinking. Station after station closed. In October of 1900, Salom and Jeantaud ceased manufacturing Electrobats. The company was dissolved. Within 5 years, fewer than 500 Electrobats remained operational in Philadelphia. Within 20 years, they were extinct. What remains is a historical record that most people who study early automotive history have never encountered. Salom and Jeantaud had solved the charging problem. They had built the infrastructure. They had created a viable ecosystem. They had failed not because of their innovation, but because the market rejected their vision in favor of a different vision. One based on infinite range, higher speeds, and a distributed fuel source that required no planning or advanced infrastructure. The irony is almost too sharp to state directly. The gasoline vehicle system came to require vast infrastructure: oil refineries, pipelines, distribution networks, service stations. It simply took time to build. Salom and Jeantaud had built their infrastructure first and hoped the market would support it. The market did support it, but only briefly, and only until a better alternative emerged. They had been right. They had been right too early, and right in a way that the world wasn't quite ready to accept. The story of the Electrobat is not really a tragedy. It's a reminder that infrastructure and vehicles are inseparable, and that the one that gets built first doesn't always survive. But there are other moments in history where the evidence suggests that someone, somewhere, understood electricity centuries before we believe it should have been possible. There's an artifact in Baghdad, dating back 2,000 years, that will make you wonder if the entire history of electrical technology is far older and far stranger than we've been taught. That's what we're uncovering next.